Well, here are some of the oldest foods that archaeologists have discovered. 2,000-year-old beef jerky was unearthed from a tomb in the village of Wanli in China. That's some pretty old jerky. A 2,400-year-old jar of salad dressing that was olive oil flavored with oregano was discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of a Greek island in the Aegean Sea. A 3,000-year-old barrel of butter was found hidden in a bog in Ireland. What are you laughing at? You know. It was a time capsule of butter. But here's what's interesting. The archaeologists, when they opened it, said it was so preserved, they actually tasted it. They tried some and they lived to tell about it. 3,000-year-old butter. They said it tasted kind of like cheese. Now, speaking of cheese, I love old cheese. I think the oldest cheese I've had is a 10-year-old cheddar. Loved it. But there's a 3,200-year-old piece of cheese found in a tomb of a pharaoh named Ptolemy's. The archaeologists that discovered it did not try that cheese. A bowl of 4,000-year-old millet noodles was discovered at the Lodja archaeological site along the Yellow River in China. Now, millet noodles are gluten-free. Those of you who thought gluten-free is a modern fad, 4,000 years ago, they were already understanding the gluten problem and coming up with gluten-free noodles. The oldest cooking recipe discovered was a list of ingredients for a red meat stew written by Sumerians around 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists discovered what is believed to be the oldest snack food. It was discovered in what is modern-day Peru. People in this region were eating popcorn 6,700 years ago. Can you believe that? They were making and eating popcorn almost 4,000 years before Jesus was born. That's incredible. I love popcorn. In fact, I love all of the things that are on this. Well, especially millet noodles. I mean, if you have a bowl of millet noodles, try and keep me away from them. I'm kidding. I don't even know what millet. Has anyone had a millet noodle? Well, we'll have to try. The next potluck, I'll be bringing millet noodles and 3,000-year-old cheese. In July 2018, in a stone fireplace in the Black Desert in Jordan, archaeologists unearthed the oldest piece of bread discovered, 14,400 years old. That's an old piece of bread. It was a flatbread that kind of looked like pita, except it was made from wild cereals that would be similar to barley, oats, and something called einkorn. That's not the oldest food. The oldest was a 17,000-year-old Twinkie found perfectly preserved. Archaeologists ate it, no problem. I'm kidding, of course, I jest. The story of food in human history is a fascinating one. And the story of food in the Bible is just as fascinating, and it is multi-layered. And it starts right at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. The story of humanity begins where? In a garden. In a garden. That's where human beings live, where the food is grown, where food is abundant. And the Creator says to humanity, I have given you every plant that produces seeds and fruit for food, every plant and tree, and the food it produces are gifts for you to enjoy, except that one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat that food. Now, there's two insights that we are given about food, about life in general, right in the beginning of the biblical text. The first one is this. Humans were originally vegetarians. I'm not vegetarian. I'm not promoting my personal agenda. In fact, I've been accused of being the opposite of a vegetarian, but I find it interesting. In the beginning, humans were vegetarians, and one could make the argument that it is permissible to eat meat, but perhaps not God's ideal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I haven't worked it out, and I don't even know if I want to make that argument. But the argument could be made. The second insight is this. From the very beginning, food is presented with this paradoxical tension. It is both a blessing and a gift, and it is a temptation. Does that ring true? Oh my goodness. Food is a blessing and a gift, but it is also a temptation. We move to Genesis chapter 2. We see humanity's fall from their state of grace, their exile from the paradise of the garden is a matter of food. The Bible teaches us food is something that moves us towards God, but it is also something that can move us away from God. I'm not going to go chapter by chapter. Let's jump to the next book, Exodus. We read that the Hebrews are enslaved. They are in captivity in Egypt, and they pray to God. They plead with God. They beg God to set them free. And finally, God responds and says, I will deliver you, my people, and I will take you to the promised land. And how does God describe the promised land? As a land flowing with milk and honey. God's freedom, God's promise, God's future is described as a place where there is abundant food. Let's jump to the next book, Numbers. On the way to the promised land, it takes a bit longer than the Hebrews were anticipating. And it becomes more difficult. As they are traveling to the promised land, the land of freedom, the land flowing with milk and honey, the Hebrews begin to complain. They say, if only we had some meat to eat. Oh, remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost to us. And the cucumbers and the melons and the onions and the garlic. The Hebrews start missing Egypt, the very land that they had pleaded for God to set them free from. They start pining for their days of captivity in Egypt. Why? Because the food was better. Oh my goodness, how powerful is that metaphor for life? I'd rather go back to slavery and bondage as long as the food's good. Is that resonating with anyone? Oh my goodness. I'd rather go back to my addiction and my inflammation and digestive issues. I'd rather go back to that because the food tastes better. In the Torah, God gives the Hebrews a long-term restoration project. How to deal with sin. And what is often overlooked is it comes with a meal plan. In fact, within the heart of Israel's animal sacrifice system is this invitation to come and feast and fellowship with God. God tells them at least once a year to bring a food offering to God's home, to the temple, and to light up the fire on God's altar and essentially have a big barbecue party. We often focus on the atonement for sin. That's only part of what's happening in the animal sacrifice system. There's this invitation of God, come on, let's get together with abundant food and let's eat together. Let's do life together. And this includes everyone. As we keep reading through the Torah and the prophets, God makes it clear that everyone is welcome at the table of God. Those who can't afford a calf to bring or a lamb or a pigeon or anything at all, there is a way for everyone to be included at the table and be part of God's big barbecue party. In fact, this is a major theme in the Old Testament teachings, is that food is important to humanity. What's important to God is that all human beings have enough food to eat. Incredible amount of teaching in the Old Testament, especially to those of us who are wealthy, affluent. And basically what that means is we have more than enough to eat. And that's most of us. So many commands, commanding us to share with those who don't have enough. One example, and then I'll move on. Leviticus chapter 23, God says, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field. And do not go back and pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living in your midst. This is incredibly important to God. Food is important for humanity. What's important to God is that all human beings have enough food to eat. Moving along, this is all part of the epic story of food in the Bible. In the Torah, God gives the Hebrews a calendar of feasts. There's 7 major feasts that God gives the Hebrews. Now that's one, on average, about one every 7 weeks. It's important for us to recognize that God expects and God demands that we feast together. Like we can make an idol of food and feasting and eat too much. We can also make an idol of asceticism. Right? As one of my good friends always says, all things in moderation, including moderation. It's important to God that we take time, at least 7 times a year, to feast. Now, as we move into the prophets and the minor prophets in the Old Testament, we see that food and wine are often perceived as being evidence of God's blessing. And a lack of food and wine is perceived as evidence of God's judgment. But we also see that sometimes a lack of food is an intentional choice. You see, when things go wrong, the Hebrews fast. They have a practice called fasting. And what fasting is to deny ourselves the food of life. It's a way of heightening our awareness of what has gone wrong, both within us, in our lives, and what has gone wrong in the world around us. And fasting is a kind of prayer meant to demonstrate to God and to ourselves the seriousness with which we are taking our confession, our supplication, and our intercession on behalf of other people. It's taking serious that we really do want the world around us to change and that we want ourselves to be changed. Fasting is a holistic reset and restoration, and it's mind, body, and soul. The intent is about restoring our relationship with God, with other people, especially other people that we have wronged, with the earth. It's about restoring our own spirits, our minds, our hearts, our bodies, our digestive systems, our metabolic health. It's a holistic and comprehensive restorative practice. And it is amazing. As we move into the New Testament, the layers of the meaning of food become more focused. Jesus' first test as a spiritual leader is to fast for 40 days. But more than that, his first test is to resist the food of the adversary. That's his first real test. And that happens in Mark chapter 1, Luke 4, Matthew 4, right at the beginning of the New Testament, the beginning of the gospel story, reveals the same interesting insight that the beginning of the Old Testament, Genesis, reveals about food. That sometimes food is a blessing, sometimes food is a temptation. That's contained right in the beginning of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Jesus teaches us that our relationship with food requires discernment. Discernment. Now, it is important to not overemphasize the call to fasting after I've just invited you to. I try to stay faithful with the life and teachings of Jesus. And what I learned from Jesus, it's important not to overemphasize the call to fasting, because when you look at Jesus' life throughout the Gospels, his life is affiliated with feasting more than anything else. In fact, the Bible tells us the Son of Man, Jesus, came eating and drinking, and that the religious leaders of his time and era accused him of being a glutton and a wine-bibber. They accused him of enjoying food and wine too much. Now that has to mean something, right? It probably means something for us. Later, Jesus was in some way unpacking this, and he said, when the groom is with you, it's not a time for fasting. That's a time for feasting. It's a time for a party. Let's eat. Jesus' life was a representation of the wedding supper of the union between God and humanity in the kingdom of God, both in this life and the next. And the reality of the kingdom of God is abundant food. Let's feast. Let's enjoy. In fact, one of the resurrection stories, the resurrected Christ comes, and, the disciples are kind of freaked out. He says, give me something to eat. I'll show you. I'm not a ghost. The risen Christ eats some food. We will eat food in the next life. It's very good news. That should be highlighted. In fact, I believe it's calorie-free feasting. Another interesting story, post-resurrection. After the resurrection, 2 disciples are journeying. They walk with the risen Christ for hours, maybe even a whole day. Now, it could have been cold outside. They were bundled up. They weren't looking at each other. They were walking, facing, this way together. And he might have had a hood on because it was cold, but they didn't recognize him. They're talking with him, walking with him for hours. It wasn't until they sat down over a meal and broke bread together that their eyes were opened and they saw the risen Christ. Food. The epic story of food in the Bible is there's so much here. Trust me, this could be a series unto itself. The last thing the risen Christ does, he makes breakfast for the disciples. Makes them breakfast. Oh, it's amazing. Sit down, let's eat together. And I one of the places that moved me the most, there's a few places where I'm like, oh, wow, I just sense the presence of Jesus here. One of them was at the shore, in a certain part, Galilee, where they said Jesus walked on water, and they have no idea where that happened. But, as I was like, it could have been here that Jesus sat down, had breakfast with his disciples. It was amazing. The last thing, and you know what the breakfast menu was? A few loaves of bread and some fish. Sound familiar? We'll get back to that maybe in a couple weeks. The last thing Jesus says, the risen Christ says, he calls Peter aside after breakfast, gives his final instruction, final teaching to the one that he has appointed to become the leader of his revolution in the world. And his final instruction, feed my sheep. Feed my followers. What does Jesus mean by that? Is Jesus referring to physical food? No. Jesus refers to food a lot in the Gospels, but when you really study his teachings, he is almost always referring to this mystical, spiritual food of the divine reality. In fact, the real message of food, according to Jesus, is an echo of a message that is revealed in the Psalms. Psalm 34, verse 8. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Have you heard that before? Taste and see that the Lord is good. The goodness of food is a reflection of the goodness of God. To taste the goodness of the gift is to experience the goodness of the giver. That's what Jesus' message is about food. Our relationship with the gifts of God, like food, is intended to move us into a deeper relationship with the giver of gifts, the creator of all. For the next 2-3 weeks, we're going to dive into what does Jesus mean when he refers to this mystical, spiritual food that physical food represents and is a symbol for. I mean, one of the interesting things Jesus says to his disciples is, they come to him and they say, you haven't eaten for a while, you better eat. And Jesus says, I have food to eat that you don't even know about. And what do they think? Wait a second, does he have a stash on him that he keeps on him and he doesn't tell us about? Oh my goodness, he has some popcorn and some cheese and fish, whatever these ancient people ate, right? Because they still don't get it, and we often don't get it. Jesus is referring to a spiritual food that actually nourishes us and energizes and provides more pleasure and comfort and strength than physical food.